Hi everyone, it's Heather from CAN and Michael from CDE, and we wanted to welcome you back to our second video interview. And a lot has been going on since we talked last, so we're just going to jump right in. So Michael, it's been basically 4 weeks today since a lot of programs shut down, since we've had school closures for about a month now. So in that time, what's been going on? What have you been hearing about?
Yeah, thanks, Heather, and welcome everyone. Um, I just want to say over the last, especially the last week, 10 days, I've heard a lot of incredible, inspiring stories about what many of you are doing across the state to support our communities and our kids and our families. We've received some videos, we've received some emails which are descriptive of what's happening. I just appreciate all of you so much for what you're doing. These continue to be challenging times. I don't know about all of you, but the last 4 weeks seems a lot longer than 4 weeks. And this week marks a big week for many school districts across the state. I know for Janae's school district, Sac City Unified, today marks the start of their official distance learning. And I know that some districts have already started that, but many of our kids are now, our students and our families are now in this position of trying to figure out how to actually do school at home with distance learning. Just a quick word about that. I have heard several messages come out from districts, understandably, but I've heard several messages frame this next chapter as making up lost instructional minutes, and especially for English language and math scores. And while I totally and wholeheartedly agree that our children and our students need instructional minutes, what I'm most concerned about is those children who are socially and emotionally really suffering or challenged during this time, facing trauma in their communities or in their homes, or just trying to figure out what this is as they've been home and isolated from their friends. I know that's plays itself out in many ways. And so here's the challenge. How do you really provide the social emotional support with children when you're not physically with them and in the classroom? And I know that that is something that's a new frontier for distance learning, and districts are working hard to figure it out. I know that, like you, I've heard countless stories of teachers who are expressing their primary concern about the well-being of their students and reaching out to their students in any way that they can to find out how they're doing socially and emotionally, exactly what I'm talking about here. And I'm most concerned about those children that have kind of dropped off the radar, those families. I know that when a teacher pulls together a video conference for their students, there's obviously students that are missing. And there are students who don't have the connectivity or the broadband width to connect via online. And so many challenges that we face as we enter this new chapter this week. And so I just want to challenge us and encourage us to understand that for all of you who have been in expanded learning, certainly me for many decades, couple decades, social and emotional support, deeply knowing our children, deeply investing in that relationship is what our DNA is. And you do it so well. And I just want to say that now is our time. We were built for this. This is our time to step up, reach out any way we can to our families and children. So some of the stories I've heard is that expanded learning staff are being used and are serving to pass out food at grab and go stops. And I've heard stories of not just handing out food, but handing out enrichment activities and resources, using that as a time to connect with parents and families. And I've heard of expanded learning staff making up activity packets for parents to take home to their kids to do, to give them some additional resources of how to do something besides just strict academics. So it's really critical that we continue to find ways to support our kids and families during this time. So that's a little bit what I'm hearing, Heather, in terms of what's going on out there. It's a little bit of what's on my mind in terms of we're moving into this next chapter of more structured distance learning. And I think we really have to work closely with our district and school partners to figure out what we can do to be part of the solution for this time in our state.
Great, thank you. I think, yeah, we've definitely been hearing a lot of the same stories and looking for ways to capture and collect those stories. Talk a little bit more about that later. But right now I want to transition to Friday's guidance that came out, and backing up, we know that the governor's executive order came out last Saturday, and then this last Friday is when the guidance from CDE came out. So if you could just talk a little bit about that process from Saturday to Friday. And I'm going to go ahead and pull the executive guidance up while you're talking about that.
Yeah, I was thrilled to see the executive order come out on a Saturday evening. And we are certainly hoping to get our guidance out much sooner than Friday afternoon. One of the challenges was, after nearly 2 weeks of working back and forth with the Department of Finance, our own internal process and attorneys here at CDE and the governor's staff, the executive order that came out was good, but it wasn't exactly what we had seen before. There were some different language, and it frankly took several days here in the department to discern exactly what the language meant and what the intent was and where to go. And as much as we would have hoped to have had guidance out by Tuesday or Wednesday, it didn't come out until Friday. And one of the challenges and the points of confusion for many of you out in the field was that the department issued a press release and guidance on part of the governor's executive order on Thursday. And those were the sections of the executive order that had to do with early learning and care and nutrition. And so when that came out and there was no mention of expanded learning, I had communication from many parts of the state, what's going on? Why isn't expanded learning mentioned here? And so we really worked hard to get the guidance out on Friday, and it didn't come out until Friday afternoon. And so I just thank you for your patience. This is a new, there's no playbook on how to get this stuff out in a timely manner, and it's a learning curve for all of us. As you're there waiting for guidance, I'm sure it produces some insecurity and some anxiety about, are we really doing the right thing, or what should we be doing differently? What is this guidance going to be? Many of you are wanting to be part of the solution of serving the children of critical infrastructure workers. And I think for me and for my team, the anxiety of trying to get all these moving pieces, and it's just incredible how many pieces have to move and in synchronization to finally get a 2-page memo out the door that is accurate and as clear as possible. So thanks for your patience. It's out there now, and hopefully this video can help us get some clarity.
So on that note, just wondering, I know the guidance came out, fairly late Friday afternoon, and it's Monday morning, but I'm sure you've gotten a few follow-up questions already. So What have you been hearing about the guidance? Kind of what initial questions have already come in?
Yeah, I'm looking at the screen. Oh, this is the executive order.
Drop it down.
Yeah, there we go. So let's go to the next slide, Heather. Probably most of the questions I have received were of two different questions. The first was in the language in the guidance memo. If you look at the assets, the second bullet in the assets column, it says grant reduction calculations required by education code are suspended for the calendar year 2019. First, let me explain what that means. So if you're not familiar with the details, when we do attendance calculations for grant reductions, if a program or a school does not meet attendance targets, that is based on a calendar year. And so in a normal year, we would be in the middle of calculating potential grant reductions for the next fiscal year, 2020-21, based on your school attendance targets of 2019. And because schools are closed and it would be difficult for people to verify whether our calculations are correct, which is a critical part of the process, we work through what a grantee has submitted and what they calculate, and we calculate any potential reductions, and then we send it back to the grantee to verify that it's accurate. And frequently, there's a percentage of grantees that contact us and said, no, that doesn't look right. And then they do some research and and I find out that they might have missed submitting part of the attendance data to us, or there was some calculation that wasn't quite correct, or some data that was missing. And they had that back and forth exchange. And many schools who are normally, according to the first round of calculations, scheduled to be reduced, are actually, that correction is made and they're not reduced. Since schools are closed and grantees are out of the building by and large, we wanted to suspend the process for grant reductions for the 2021 fiscal year. So that's what that phrase states at the bottom of the assets. There's a similar bullet point, the last bullet point at the bottom of the ACES paragraph on the previous page. Many of you noticed it is not under the 21st CCLC. And the 21st CCLC is the federal Title IV-B funds. But in California, we call the elementary and middle part of 21st century federal funds 21st century, and we call the high school funds assets. But they're both the federal funding. And many of you noticed, well, there's not a bullet point there that says the reduction calculations are suspended for calendar year 2019 for 21st century. I'm not going to get into the details of why that happened, except to say briefly, in developing the executive order, the attorneys outside of CDE noticed there was a portion of Ed Code for 21st century that references, well, there is a portion of the 21st century Ed Code that goes back and references a large block of ACES Ed Code and says, and all this also applies to 21st century. Well, the part about the grant reductions for ACES was not listed in that section of Ed Code for 21st century. So attorneys had rightly stated that according to that section of Ed Code, that CDE doesn't have the authority to reduce the grants for elementary and middle school for the federal funds. And so that suspension of the reductions for the calendar year 2019 were left off. After the executive order was issued, we discovered another portion of Ed Code that actually did reference the reductions for 21st century. So what we now know after all this work is that our Ed Code is contradictory. And that'll need to be fixed. So the main primary message is we are not going to move forward with reductions for the federal elementary and middle, even though it's missing from this guidance and missing from the executive order. That's a fix we're going to have to make in a future executive order, which we anticipate starting to work on this week. So that's the first thing. The second thing was, if you read the 21st century guidance at the top, it says, at this time, no authority has been provided to use 21st century funds to serve school-age children of essential critical infrastructure workers. There were some that interpreted, so does that mean we can use 21st century funds now, or does that mean we can't use them at all? And I want to be clear, this simply says that while the bulk of the executive order and our guidance talks about how to use ACES funds for the support of school-aged children of essential critical infrastructure workers, that is not available. The use of that 21st century federal, either elementary, middle, or assets has not been approved for that use at this point. But there are many ways that you are all using these federal funds to support students virtually, or to do planning, or to do the food pickup and drop, grab and go centers, as we talked about earlier. And all those uses of 21st century are totally applicable and encouraged. We will be, I'll mention a little bit more about this, but we will be still working on continued guidance and questions this week to talk more specifically about federal language regarding specific use of 21st century. But just know that if you're using 21st century funds to somehow support students and families and communities in a way that is still social, still safe for you and your community, then you're encouraged to do so.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And I'm wondering, maybe now we can go back to the last slide and talk more about what the guidance memo does mean for our ACES programs.
So the primary, this is the main section of the executive order, and it in essence makes serving school-age children of essential critical infrastructure workers permissible. And it gives the CDE, it basically says any part of Title 22.5 or not, Article 22.5 in the state ed code, which is our ACES ed code. It says anything in that ed code that would make it, that would prohibit a program for using ACES funds for that purpose, or for using ACES funds at a time when school would normally be in session, because remember, ACES funds are for before and after school on a day that school is in session. And this executive order did two things. First of all, what's listed here is the CDE guidance that makes it clear that ACES, if you go to the second bullet point, ACES grantees may serve school-age children of essential critical infrastructure workers, regardless of where those children attend school. So normally you can only serve, if a grant goes to Washington Elementary, you can only serve children that attend Washington Elementary with that grant. And what this bullet point, the guidance is, you can serve any child if they're a child of essential critical infrastructure workers. They can be served by the ACES grant regardless of what school they go to. The second bullet point, or the third, says, in addition to operating before and after school hours, ACES programs can also operate during the hours that school is ordinarily in session. I think that's clear enough. The fourth bullet point is ACES programs should continue to track employees' time and expenditures in accordance with California School Accounting Manual. Keep track of what you're doing. I think that's self-explanatory. And then the executive order gave the CDE authority to waive any part of 8482.3 F that would be needed in order to give ACES programs the flexibility to do this. And I'm not going to go start reading ed code to you, but we did waive section 7, 8, and 9, and 10 through June 30th, 2020. And all of that is the ed code that it relates to the evaluation reports that the ACES programs are required to send in, and the reporting of student attendance and school day attendance. So basically we're saying to you, while we're asking you to keep track of employees' time and expenditures in general of the program, we're saying you do not need to report ACES attendance as you normally would during this period of time. Of course, there should be procedures in place which will be local decisions to enroll the children in these programs if they're being served. Excuse me. And also, you should have attendance records, etc. And there should be the sign-in, sign-outs, just like you normally, like any safe procedure for children would be. But those records will not be required to be sent in to the CDE on the typical forms that are listed in this part of the ed code. So there could be more questions that come up as this goes on. Heather, let's go to the very end. Oh, there's a portion of the guidance memo that's not on here, which basically, for guidance related to proper social and physical distancing and healthy practices for ACES programs operating pursuant to this memo, please refer to the Department of Social Services Social and Physical Distancing Guidance. There's a link on the webpage on this guidance that has a website which is very clear about state procedures which were developed last week on if you're going to provide, if you're going to serve school-age children of essential critical infrastructure workers, then there are guidelines you should follow. Now, before the state issued that guidance last week, the Department of Social Services, these guidelines were county by county determined. And the executive order required the Department of Social Services to work with CDE to create statewide norms and guidance for providing services. Now, don't confuse this executive order with what is technically called emergency childcare or pop-up services. That is language that's reserved for licensed programs, and ACES programs are license exempt. So those are two different things, but either way, you should work closely with your local county officials and your school district if you're considering uses ACES funds to serve school-age children of essential critical infrastructure workers.
Thanks, Michael. That's great. That's a lot of info. So
yes, it is.
So I think very high level, just recapping so I understand. If I'm going to give somebody the 30-second what's in this guidance, I would basically be saying that this guidance and how the division is going to move forward is suspending grant reduction calculations, and also is allowing our ACES programs flexibility to serve school-age children of essential critical infrastructure workers, waiving a lot of the requirements that they normally would have in place.
I guess you could have just said that.
Well,
save me all the explanation.
But yeah, the nuance is important, but if someone was to give the kind of very high level overview.
Yeah, and one of the questions I got right after the executive order came out from several places was, does this mean that we're going to be required to serve these children? And I want to come back to, no, this makes it permissive to serve. We've had many, many programs in county offices, grantees from across the state asking for the permission to use the funds in this way, and this makes that permissive. It is not a directive from CDE to serve. Now, there are many nonprofits who are watching this video that subcontract with a school district to operate the programs. And we've had the question, I've had the question, does this mean, what if the district is saying you have to provide these services? those are local decisions. So what we're saying is whatever agreements are made locally, or what a grantee, whether it's a 21st century district or community-based organization, or an ACES grant that goes to an LEA, lead educational agency, that has subcontractors, how the funds are used, or if they're used in this way, are decisions that are made locally. This guidance and the executive order is not a directive to use the funds in this way. It's permissive to use the funds in this way.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a lot of the questions I've been getting too. So that's super helpful. So I think we pretty much covered the guidance, but we know there are still a lot of other questions out there that weren't really captured in this guidance or the executive order. So wondering what's next for you in the division.
Well, starting today, we're still working with getting out in writing the answer to some of the questions that you've been sending in the last 3 to 4 weeks. A lot of that was put on hold while we worked through this. This language, it's 2 pages. It seems pretty clear, but it's days and days and days of negotiating and clarity and discerning and interpreting that go into these 2 pages. We're now turning our attention towards 2 things. The question we've heard most that we have not addressed yet is, will we be allowed to expend ACES funds or 21st century funds past the June 30th deadline? For those that don't know, the law is that if you, not the law, but the practice, the administrative guidance and practice is that if you don't spend the money by June 30th or have it encumbered, then it goes back to the state. And part of what's on our agenda this week is to clearly figure out with both Department of Finance, accounting, practice and guidelines, and our legal, whether we are able to extend the grant end date past June 30th. We don't know if we can, how long that will be. My biggest concern is that most of you at least have heard what we've been talking about for the last decade about summer learning loss, that unless children have engaging enrichment activities during the course of the summer, that they will slide back from where they finished off the school year. Well, now we've got summer learning loss times 2. We've got months off, and for many, I'm just going to say it, for many of our most, for many of our kids, that this distance learning, our vulnerable kids, the distance learning approach is not going to keep them up to speed. They're going to continue to slide. As well as intended as our educators are and doing the best that they can, there are many children who will not benefit as others with the distance learning. And so that summer slide is now going to be extended. And I am, and we don't know what's going to happen in June or July, but what I would say is, as soon as we can start to gather our children together again, we need to do whatever we can to get as many resources to them as we can. Now, having said that, the state is also facing incredible fiscal shifts. The revenue, the projections, the budget that was being discussed is all out the window. And there could be a push to take unspent state resources from any source to go back and repair the huge gap and loss of revenue for other critical state services. So that might come up. That might be something that prevents us to issue an extension of the grant. all those are still questions. I'm giving you the full story. I'm not holding back any cards here. That's what we're working on this week. And we, we will get information to you as soon as we can.
Well, thanks for that. I think that that's all the questions I have this week. But I do know that you have a special invitation for programs, so we'd like to end our video on that note. So I'll turn it over to you for that.
What we all need to hear are the amazing stories, transformational stories of how so many of you are making such a huge difference in the lives of our students and families and communities. I need to collect as many of those as possible. I need to curate a vast library of stories that I can share with policymakers and decision makers, and to share back out with each of you, because there's amazing things happening. I've seen the videos, I've heard the stories. We need to have those. So send them to me, to Heather, to Can. We'll just send them anywhere that you know where to send them, and we'll curate them. And Heather and I both hope next week to not just have us two on the video, but to actually have a couple of people from around the state that represent some of those amazing stories. So just keep up the great work. These are hard days. I know that going into week 5 now, that no one wants to say the new normal. But these adjustments are really difficult for all of us as humans. What I just really am inspired by is because of all the amazing work and all the amazing things that you're doing to support kids and families and each other. So from those of us here at the California Department of Education, Expanded Learning Division, all the county offices, California After School Network, ASAP Connect, all the folks that make up the system of support for expanded learning, we are here for you. We're with you. We're in this together, and we will get through it and get to a better day. So thank you, Heather, for hosting again, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time.